was speaking to a feminist friend. Feminism is going to be one of the main themes of our interview. And I told her I was going to interview you. And she said, and it took me a second to realize that she wasn't being completely ironic or snarky. She goes, well, ask her why she hates women. And I kind of laughed and was dismissive, but I realized there was a note of seriousness behind that. So I'm going to give you the opportunity now, to Professor, to throw yourself on the ground, repudiate yourself, confess your sins, and repent.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure where she gets that idea from. I don't know whether that's based on the fact that I call myself an anti-feminist, or whether that's based on anything that I've actually said in my hundreds of videos and talks and interviews. But I don't hate women. I guess I could say that I hate what feminism has made of some feminist activists, and we can get into that in more detail. I certainly don't hate women at all. Being anti-feminist just means that I oppose an ideology that I believe is founded on hatred and bigotry and female moral supremacism. I reject all of those things. So the part of the issue there is that feminists have been quite successful in equating feminism with being pro-woman, or equating feminism with being pro-equality. And I think the vast majority of people in the world today, or at least in the Western world, which is what I know best, but probably in the whole world, if asked, would say, yes, they are pro-equality. In other words, that they believe in the inherent value, equal value of both men and women. Some people, of course, would say that what they are for is for equity, in other words, equal outcomes. And that is a different thing. Not all people who believe that men and women have equal dignity and equal value and are equal in their contributions to society. Not all people, therefore, believe that men and women should be represented 50-50, in every single sphere of society, and that should be socially engineered as an outcome. Some of us don't think that's a good idea, but that certainly doesn't mean that we don't believe that women are equally valuable in society. But I would contest the claim that feminism cares about equality. I don't think it actually does in any way. It tends to assert that women are better at the things that matter most in our society, and it tends to blame all men as a class for various evils in the world. It tends to assert that men need to take responsibility for inequalities, or for injustices, or for violence against women, for issues that those individual men have no actual personal responsibility for. They're told that they have to accept the blame for those things, apologize for those in their person, and even pay the price for those things by taking a step back and applauding as their sisters, real or metaphorical, come to the fore and are given more responsibility and more positions of power. I think that that is simply injustice, that's class vengeance. And I don't see why young men today, or any man today, should have to shoulder the burden of collective guilt. I think that's a terrible way to set up a society. At the same time, I would also say that very few feminists think that women should have to shoulder the burden for anything bad any individual woman has ever done. All mothers are not shamed because some individual mothers harm their children or even murder their babies. All women are not held to account because some women make false accusations of sexual assault against men. All women do not have to bear the burden of shame because some women write articles with hateful titles like "Why Can't We Hate Men?" which was an article written by not just any woman, but by a feminist professor at Northeastern University named Susanna Walters, who wrote in all seriousness in 2017 during the heyday of the Me Too movement, an article titled "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And her answer was, because men are hateful. And so we can hate men, and we should hate men, and we should tell men that they're not worth anything in our society. They're the cause of all the problems in the world, and they should just absent themselves. We women have got it. We women will now take charge, and men should simply be grateful to us for doing that. And that was written in all seriousness in the Washington Post by a feminist professor who still teaches feminist studies and sociology at Northeastern University. She has a respected position of cultural authority, and she was not denounced by other feminists. She was not disavowed. Yeah. And unfortunately, there are many, many examples of that kind of hatred, and that is what I oppose. I don't hate women. I don't even hate feminists, because I think there are some reasonable feminists, but I do hate feminism as an ideology, and I don't think it should have any position in our society, and it certainly should not be equated with a concern for equality, because it's not about equality, as my research has shown me.
I'm going to put all the hyperlinks to your work in the comments field when this goes live. But look, I suppose we really should get into definitions first, so that we're talking about the same thing, because you've covered off on a lot of issues. Now, prior to seeing a lot of your work and some other experiences that I had, which I need not go into here, I always associated feminism with just the idea of, as you said, equality of opportunity. That from the Judeo-Christian ideal that it doesn't matter. In Christ Jesus, there is not man, there is not woman, there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, there is no slave, there is no owner. That's the injunction of spiritual and personal equality. We're all made in the image of God. I believe that equal opportunity is a good thing, and that's what I always associated feminism with. But that's not how you see feminism or how you define it, is it?
Right. No, it isn't. And I agree with you that that is a wonderful value, that every person should be given an equal opportunity. It's impossible, of course, for everyone to have an entirely equal opportunity, because we have different experiences. Some of us are raised in abusive homes, and some of us have various disabilities that are very difficult to overcome. So, of course, nobody can guarantee that sort of equal opportunity, but to the best of our abilities, I believe in a society that tries to make it possible for every human being to make their contribution to the world, and that they shouldn't be discriminated against on the basis of any characteristic that they can't control. Each person, we have to recognize each person as an individual. We have to recognize that this is a cliche, but it's so true, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, that there is not one class of people who have a lean on morality or goodness or intelligence or capability, and another class of people who are seen as somehow lesser or despicable or deserving of blame and punishment. And unfortunately, feminism has become that thing. And I would say, in fact, that if you go back to the origins of feminism in the 19th century, or even further back you can trace it. I mean, finding origins is always difficult. You can trace it right back to the late 18th century or even sooner. But it was and is an ideology that divides people up into classes, into identity categories. And some categories it defines as good, as virtuous victims who should be congratulated for their courage in struggling to overcome their difficult circumstances. And then there is another class, or various classes, who are oppressors, who are privileged and entitled, according to feminists, and who should have to apologize for their privilege and their entitlement, and who are not entitled to fairness, who can be discriminated against in, for instance, affirmative action hiring, who can be discriminated against in courts of law, in family court, for example, when it comes time to determine which parent should have custody in a case of disputed custody. In all of those cases, many more, feminism is not interested in equality or in the individual worth of people. It's interested in categorizing people according to whether they're male or female, whether they're white or of color, according to whether they are able-bodied or disabled, according to whether they're heterosexual or homosexual, and so on. And feminism is absolutely obsessed with those kinds of categories and with assigning different types of blame or different types of exoneration from blame, depending on what category one belongs to. And that's the exact opposite of what feminism claims to be about, and what I think most people would hope it would be about.
I don't believe that one's sex, of course, determines their moral superiority or inferiority, but I think there's something in the argument that women are kind of more civilized than men and have a civilizing influence on men. And so, like, I associate the feminine with, hearth, home, protection, decency, morality, and this kind of civilizing influence. And I don't think that's just mythical. I don't think that that's a social construct. I think that's a recognition of some of the psychological aspects of being a woman, and how those psychological aspects play out in the world. And I'd just be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I find those kinds of generalizations sort of difficult to engage with, because I tend to be most interested in specific actions of individuals. And I think I would agree to the extent that many men are very interested in making a contribution to the world that is focused on a woman and on building a home and building a society that allows women and children to flourish. So to that extent, I would agree that men and women together have created civilization through the particular relationship between them. Yes, I think probably in certain ways, when it comes to certain standards of behavior, a lot of men respond to what they perceive women want them to be. Yeah. And they're very focused on, many men, their highest desire is to be approved by a woman, or women in general, loved by a woman. They want to build a home for the woman that they love. And so to that extent, I think a good woman is a civilizing force, but men are part of that too, because it is the men who build the civilization from the basic dirty, dangerous, difficult work of building the roads and the buildings and the electricity and the plumbing and the everything that men have done and continue to do, the most difficult work, the mining work, the fishing, the lumbering, etc., the sewer work, etc., to make our civilization secure and prosperous, to make places that are safe for the raising of children and safe for women. So I would say that, it's true that at its best, that is the civilizational force. Men loving women and women making it possible for men to strive to achieve the wonderful things that men have achieved over the millennia. But what I see that feminism does is that it cuts out one part of that equation, and it says that women are all good and men are all bad. Men have done nothing but war and oppress and subjugate. It doesn't look at any of the sacrifices that men have made in order to create civilization, the sacrifices indeed in war, the sacrifices in killing work. It ignores all that. And what I'm most worried about, I think, is that I would say that all civilizations, and all civilizations, I think it would be fair to say up until now, and this is a vast generalization, of course, but they operate according to some kind of gender contract where the ideal civilizations anyway, the ones that have flourished and worked well, have involved mutual cooperation and mutual recognition of one another's strengths. And this is why I am adamant that I am not anti-woman, because for a civilization to work well and for it to be prosperous, it's necessary that men recognize what women bring to civilization, and vice versa. It's necessary that women recognize what men bring to civilization. And in the past, there were traditional societies that recognized the particular biological propensities of men and women and built roles for men and women around those, around their natures. And so it meant that men tended to be the providers, the protectors, they were the warriors, the leaders, the lawmakers, they were the ones that made the land productive. But women also, of course, had very important roles as nurturers, of course, as childbearers, but also as companions and helpmeets. And they did also work, of course, in the home and outside in the fields too. And what feminism has done has said, we don't want those roles anymore. We think that all roles should be open to women. We think that these previous societies were very restrictive. And I would say that in general, most men are perfectly happy with that. There's the demand that men must recognize women's right to take up whatever kind of work they want to do, and whether that involves soldiering or working as a firefighter or whatever it happens to be, but it's more often, the corner office in the law firm or a seat at the table on a Fortune 500 company. Those are the kinds of things that feminists tend to be interested in for women. You don't see a lot of women agitating to get into the sewer work, or the mining work or any of those, or the basic construction, the types of work that account for the 97% of men who are the fatalities or the injuries on the job. You don't see a lot of feminist agitation for equality of representation when it comes to the 97% of workplace fatalities. But anyway, so I think most men have been really happy to encourage women to do whatever they want to do, and that has been demanded of men, and I think men have come through with that. So now what I wonder about is what happened to the reciprocity, though? What is the new gender order? We hear a lot about what men owe women. Much of it is still the traditional providing and protecting. If a man and woman are lying together, let's say husband and wife lying together in bed at night, and there's a smash downstairs as somebody barrels through the front door, does the woman say, "Oh, I believe in equality, I'm going to go down there and take on the intruder"? No, it tends not to be. It's the man who risks his life to protect, and most men are happy to do that. They don't expect the woman to do that. So what I look for from feminists is some kind of recognition that while women have demanded and indeed achieved entry into many spheres of endeavor that were formerly mainly male, where is the recognition of what women owe to men? Do women owe men anything in this new order? Do they owe men gratitude? Do they owe men emotional support? The bare minimum, I would say, that they owe men is to stop the hatred. And so that when somebody like Susanna Walters, the professor at Northeastern University, or there's many, many others, there's Mona El-Tahawi, there's Andrea Dworkin, there's Catherine McKinnon, there's Julie Bindel, there's so many that I've kept track of over the years who have written hateful and bigoted articles, feminist articles about men, slandering men, saying the most ridiculous things about them, talking about toxic masculinity, talking about how all sex is a form of rape and is injurious to women, all heterosexual sex, that is. When I see that, And I don't see a backlash by feminists. I don't see them ejecting those feminist women from the community of feminists. I don't see them saying this is unfair, this is unjust, and it's untrue. That's when I really begin to wonder whether feminists feel any obligation to men to be fair, to be loving, to be empathetic. I think most men are quite happy to say, yeah, I love women. I want to support them. I especially love the women in my life. When I talk to women and ask them about their love for men, not a lot of women express a deep desire to care for men or nurture them or to be fair to them or to help them achieve their life goals. There's the idea that men still exist to support women. And I don't know what women feel they owe men, or at least feminist women.
It is amazing what we men will do to impress women, create entire societies, to pick an example entirely at random.
Exactly.
One of the other things that's kind of implicit in that is, and I actually don't know if I said the right thing to my son, but we were discussing this, and he's quite young, but we were discussing male and female relations, because he's got two elder sisters and they're so smart. They are razor smart women. They're articulate, and they just kind of henpeck him and bully him a bit, to be honest, because although he's not dumb, he's not as articulate as them. He's not as perceptive as them. So they kind of lord it over him a bit. And one of the things we were discussing, I said, mate, look, something you got to understand is there's a fact that no one wants to acknowledge, but I think is true. And that is that we men are expendable. And women just aren't. And I mean that biologically, I mean that societally. And if push comes to shove, like there's a reason it used to be women and children first into the lifeboats, because that's our job. Like, we are expendable. You have to understand that at the bottom of your heart. As a man, you just got to accept it. It's like, yes, we deserve all these. Yes, we deserve respect. Yes, we deserve all these things. I of course I agree. Like, I'm a bloke. But I kind of accept the fact that we are expendable too. Like, if push comes to shove, it's got to be us. Like, we're the ones going down with the ship. You know what I mean? We are the ones going down and facing.
Yes, well, that's true, and certainly that was the case on the Titanic when it went down in 1912, if I'm remembering the year correctly. If you look at the survival rates there, the greatest indication of who was going to survive that shipwreck was whether you were female or not. And it didn't matter whether you were in third class or second class or first class. You were much more likely to survive if you were a woman. So, like, I think a sane society would recognize that and have a conversation about that, instead of pretending that men are privileged and oppressive and entitled. They would talk about the death gap in those kinds of situations, and they would honor men for their willingness to engage in that kind of self-sacrifice. Now, I think that's an interesting point about men being expendable. And I've heard that a lot, that's discussed a lot. And it's true that mothers are absolutely essential to the survival of human societies. So childbearing women, and of course it takes a much more female energy and time to carry a child to term, and then to look after that child when it's still helpless and needs to be breastfed, etc. So that takes years of a woman's life, and she needs to be protected while that's going on, where it doesn't take a man years in order to produce a child. So in that sense, yes, women are not expendable in the way that men are. But of course, men are not really entirely expendable. A society without men is not going to do very well at all, right? Maybe fewer men can keep the society going, but you need men in war. You need men to invent and create, because that has been a male preserve for a very long time. And I think there's even a biological root of that. Maybe it even has something to do with the fact that women create life and men create other things because they don't create life in the same way. Of course, they're necessary for the creation of life too, but you know what I mean? Like they don't raise children in that sense. They don't get pregnant and nurture children. So men are necessary. And, and that idea that women are absolutely necessary, well, it's kind of ironic in a sense, because mothers are necessary, but more and more women now are choosing not to have children at all. And yet they continue to feel entitled to male protection and support, and to all of the civilizational empathy and concern that is so often focused on women. So again, it's like there's this gender contract that we've been handed to us from our past, our human past. And feminism took all of that empathy and care and concern that human societies have for women. They demanded change. They demanded their rights. They demanded that men listen to what they were asking for and demanding, and men did. And now they've turned that contract on its head and said, we don't necessarily want to have children. We certainly don't want to be nurturers necessarily, only if we want to. And we don't owe you men anything. So what kind of a contract are we left with then? And we're left with a lot of anger and continued demands that men do this or do that for women. And to me, it just doesn't seem to be a sustainable kind of relationship. And so that's where my real objection comes in. For the last 50 years, we've been focusing on what women want and what women demand. And a lot of men have been really happy to provide that. But now a lot of men aren't doing that well. We've got men falling behind in all sorts of areas, specifically in schooling. There's a devastating report that came out of MIT by two economics researchers, David O'Toole and Melanie Wasserman. It came out some years ago now. It's called Wayward Sons, the Emerging Gender Gap in Labor Markets and Education. And they make the point that men and women born after, I think it's 1975, I could have the exact year wrong, but it's something like that. You see this gap really specifically developing, where more and more women are pulling ahead in higher education, and that translates into their employment prospects, and that translates into their real wages, and it translates into their job status and all sorts of things. And so for all these people who believe that feminism is about equality, I'd like to see some recognition of the problems that young and not so young men are having now in schooling and in various other spheres of society. There are whole areas of university education now where men are like radically underrepresented. Does anybody care about that? I don't see that many feminists raising their voices in concern over the fact that if you look at the education faculty at universities, it's something like, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's something like 20% male. In many areas of social science, even medicine, even law, women are outpacing their male counterparts. So are we really interested in equality? Or do we feel like for the next 100 years, in some sort of historical vengeance project, we will just let men fall behind in all of these spheres? And that creates all sorts of problems for women too, because women still tend to want to marry a man who has a very good job. Many women actually want to marry a man who makes more money than they do. So at the same time that they're demanding affirmative action hiring to get women in all sorts of very high paying, powerful positions, they're also not very happy to marry a man who's going to make less money. And they're certainly not very happy with the idea of marrying a man whom they're going to then financially support. So there's all sorts of problems and contradictions and elements of hypocrisy in the feminist project. And those worry me a great deal. And of course, there's just also the basic lack of concern for men not doing well. There are all sorts of, if you put in Google a phrase like how to keep women out of prison, you will find all sorts of articles talking about strategies to nurture women who fall into crime. But if you, that's somewhat ironic given that women account for only about 3 to 5% of the prison population. So, how do you make sense of the fact that 95% of the prison population is male? Well, the feminist answer is men commit more crime. Okay. But then if you say, well, how do you make, what do you make of the fact that 90%, let's say, of Nobel Prize winners are male? They'll say that's because there's injustice and inequality. So which is it? Is there every time it's a gender discrepancy, is it because of inequality and injustice? Or is it because of, biologically based differences in behavior and talent and that sort of thing? Whenever it's a gap that disadvantages women, feminists say we should do something about it. We should make it so that women are faring better. Whenever it's a gap that disadvantages men, the feminists say, oh, well, that's just that's men's fault. Men are doing it to themselves. So again, that has nothing to do with equality. That has to do with an assertion that we should care more about women. And in general, men and women alike do care more about women. And I don't care more about women. I care about men equally. So that is my anti-feminism.
Wow. That's so well articulated. And now I think I get it. I think I'm going to have to actually reassess some of the things that I think, because I kind of do care about women a bit more, to be honest, because of the expendability, the discussion that we've had. But one of the other things, like part of the reason, there were so many reasons I wanted to chat to you, but I also spoke to the magnificent Edie Wyatt. That's the pen name of this lady who I interviewed a few weeks ago. And she's brilliant. Honestly, I enjoyed that conversation so much. One of the few things that, and she's a self-described feminist, I think you actually have more in common with her than you don't. I
doubt it.
I genuinely think that you'd be pleasantly surprised. Like, I mean, if you're going to look for the distinctions and the differences, I think you've got more in common with her than you don't. But one of the things that I disagreed with her was, she said, when she was studying feminism and all that, she loved it. She was right into it. She was enamored by this, by the fight that women had to have for their rights. And I've got to say, that's the only thing that I kind of disagreed with. Now, I agree that there was
a feminist myth. It's a feminist myth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree there was a struggle. I mean, it's
not really.
But yeah, there was kind of, but there wasn't a war. Like the comparative analogy I use in my head is slavery in America. Some people were kind of saying, a group of people were saying, you can't keep those people, you can't treat them as subhuman and treat them as chattels because of the color of their skin. That's just wrong. You can't do that. The people keeping those slaves went, actually, we're going to. And you know what? Me and my rifle say that you just can't do that. You're not allowed to, that you can't take that person away from me. That's a fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, absolutely.
However 100,000 deaths there were in the American Civil War, I've got off the top of my head, I think it's 500,000 or something. Yeah,
or even higher, I think 600,000, maybe 700,000, but very high.
I mean, stand corrected on the number, but it was absolutely huge. Whereas you looked what happened with the feminist movement. I mean, there was real struggle. I mean, there was marches in the street. There was people throwing themselves in front of horses. There was going into bars. There was all that political activity. I would define that as a struggle, but I would not define that as a fight, because fundamentally, what happened is, and I think this is in agreement with the thrust of what you're saying, is basically women came and said to men, "Hey, look, there's this massive injustice. It's wrong. We want equal opportunity. Give that to us." And by and large, they kind of did. They did, and it was even before. The thing that kind of like gets me is, if it only had have happened in the 1960s, with obviously with birth control, you'd kind of get it. But like, this was, really the first. I mean, more about this than me, so I'm happy to stand corrected. But really, it was the First World War that we really started to see this, when we were forced into it was like, oh, there's no men. Okay, you're driving the buses, you're going to be the police officers, you're in the factories, you're doing this. You still can't control your birth, by the way. Oh, and you're doing all the work at home. You're doing everything else, but you're also doing this. And kind of like women looked at it and went, yeah, actually, this isn't too bad. I actually, although I don't want to work in an ammunition factory for my entire life, the idea that I can broaden my horizons and get a degree of financial and personal independence is a good thing. So that's the way I see it. I see it as a struggle because, it did take some time. People didn't immediately go, yeah, okay. But it happened, and it happened rather quickly, and it happened independent of
it happened very quickly. I think that's the thing that is significant, is that the gap between the time when most or all men had the right to vote in democratic societies and the time when most or all women had the right to vote in democratic societies. I mean, we're speaking mainly about the Anglosphere. I don't really know the history of non-English speaking countries. So we're talking about Great Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States. That the gap between men having the right to vote and women having the right to vote in general is so vanishingly small. And most of us don't even know that. And in fact, I studied this as part of my PhD. I had no idea that the gap was so small. I thought that all men had had the right to vote for hundreds of years before women had the right to vote. And I think many, many people, if you ask them in the street, would also believe that. And in fact, in Great Britain, the men who went off to fight in the First World War, 40% of those men who were propertyless and poor did not have the right to vote.
Exactly right.
So when women were given the right to vote, and you're right, it was as a result of their work in munitions factories, etc., that when they were given the right to vote, I don't think anybody now realizes that right was also at the same time extended to voteless servicemen. The vote was taken in the British House of Parliament in 1917 to reward those servicemen and also to reward the women who had worked in the munitions factories, etc. So that to me is staggering, that we talk about women struggling for their rights, and we don't even acknowledge that the men who went to be hideously maimed or killed, to have their guts ripped out in the trenches of Europe, many of them didn't have the right to vote. Feminists then didn't acknowledge that, to my knowledge, not at all. And feminists now still don't acknowledge that. And to me, that alone, that omission, that fudge of history is enough to call the whole project into doubt. And if anybody who seriously looks into the history of the extension of voting rights in the United Kingdom sees that beginning in the early 19th century, only a tiny, tiny proportion of men had the right to vote. By 1832 was the first democratic reform that gave the vote to about 1 in 6 adult men. So 5 out of 6 adult men in 1832 still couldn't vote. In 1867, there was another reform that gave the vote to most working class men in urban centers. In 1884, that was extended to most working class men in rural areas. But it was still the case after 1884, and this is while the feminist movement was picking up steam, that it was still the case that about 40% of British men, because there were still property and wealth qualifications, 40% still didn't have the right to vote. So, what was this great struggle? And some various militant feminists went around setting off bombs. They burnt churches to the ground. They attempted to assassinate Prime Minister Herbert Asquith in 1912. They firebombed the homes of parliamentarians. They physically attacked police officers. all this, because they felt so outraged at their subjugated position. While meanwhile, they weren't so different from the men who were forced to defend their country with their lives in war. So I don't see, when you really start to look at the history, you can see ways that women were prevented from fulfilling their life possibilities. I suppose if one wants to look at things through a feminist lens, you have to realize this was a time when, before effective mass birth control, most women, most of the time were bearing children, nurturing those children, looking after them. It was thought that most women didn't have time or interest in national affairs to have the vote.
Just too busy.
The idea was they were too busy. They just weren't interested. Women did have things to do outside of the home. Certainly, many women were involved in charity work. Many women did participate in local politics. It was at the national level that the franchise was denied to women in particular. And it was believed that the ballot was a metaphorical, was a metaphor for war. So it was believed that the male responsibility was, if necessary, to defend with one's life one's country. And women did not ever have that particular responsibility. They had other responsibilities. They risked their lives in childbearing if they chose to marry and have children. So, it was that idea that there were these two separate spheres and they were equally important, but they had different rights and responsibilities. Women demanded the right to vote and to be involved in politics, and that right was given to them. And fairly soon after they started demanding it, they were never asked to surrender their lives in the service of their country during a time of war. Some women chose to do so. A very small minority of women chose to do so, but they were never forced to defend their country at time of war. So they got the right without the responsibility. And yet feminists still claim that the world is patriarchal and women are, deprived of all these male privileges. But the male privilege of being destroyed in war is not something that feminists tend to be very interested in talking about. And if they are cornered on that subject, they'll say, oh, that's because men fight wars. Men create war, right? Women don't, and that's where we get into the myth of female moral superiority. It was a common feminist claim back in the 19th century that once women had the vote, there would be no more war because women would never vote for war. There's absolutely no evidence in the history of human civilization that queens were less likely to go to war than kings. In fact, I've seen studies that claim the opposite, that actually queens were more likely to wage war than kings. Yes. You could certainly make the argument that women, knowing that their sex is not the one that has to risk itself in war, have a different attitude and perhaps even a less responsible attitude than men do towards war. And that's just a hypothetical claim. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily true, but it is striking that while feminists are claiming that they are disenfranchised and disempowered, that they have the same rights now, the same political rights as men, without the terrible responsibility of having to give one's life during war, as all men in the United States do. For example, men who vote have to sign up for the selective service system, which means that they can be drafted in a time of war, whether they want to go to war and be killed or not. Women don't, and there's never any thought of making a draft mandatory for women because our society, again, in general, can't bear the thought of those kinds of harms to young women and middle-aged women as it can to men. So, in just so many different, we could go on and look at all different examples, but, the fact of the matter is that in general, both men and women are more concerned about the suffering of girls and women than about the suffering of boys and men. And feminism has capitalized on that and used that concern in order to advance their various demands and agendas. And it's time to stop. It's time to stop pretending that women are universally disadvantaged and men are universally privileged, because it just clearly is not so, and it's not fair. It's based on lies, and it does real harm to many individual men who not only have to recognize that their society doesn't care as much about them as about women, but then also have to be told that they're responsible for all the evil in the world and that they should be ashamed of themselves because they happen to be born male. I just think that should stop. And it's really unforgivable. And I can't forgive any feminist who doesn't speak against that every day of her life. And I don't hear many feminists objecting to those assumptions and claims.
Yeah, it's so like the recent racial movements too, where, you know, it's just being white is enough to define you as a bad person. And I've just come out of the Queensland Police Service, and you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, and I got to admit, I was half sucked in because, you know, you hear the phrase Black Lives Matter. I mean, who was going to disagree with a slogan like that? Of course. No rational human being. But it turns out that's not exactly what it's about. And for us over here, because they couldn't use the shootings, because although we're an armed service, like the Canadians, there's really there's so few shootings over here, especially of Indigenous people, that it's one of the things that people were saying over here was was deaths in custody. Now, we had Black Lives Matter really in the late 80s, without the cool, catchy slogan. We had a royal commission, and as you know, living in a constitutional monarchy yourself, but for listeners who don't, a royal commission is the highest form of public inquiry that can be held in a constitutional monarchy. It gets owned, like the government starts it off, but it gets owned by the normally an ex-judge or someone like that who holds it, and they own it. They can do whatever they want, find whatever they want. So this commission into deaths in custody happened in the late 80s, and the findings were handed out in the early 90s, just when I joined the police. And it was explicitly stated in the findings. It's like, you know, we expected to find that there was going to be police brutality and brutality of prison guards, and that people were being murdered. That was the expected finding. And we found zilch, zero, de nada, nix, absolutely nothing to back that up. And in fact, some papers were released a few years after that from the criminology division of the commission itself. So of course they had a criminology division. They employed a whole bunch of criminologists to go and gather the data. And when they were gathering the data and interpreting it, saying, no, look, the evidence is not there. The coppers and the screws aren't murdering anyone. It's just not happening. Mate, there were guys who were kind of like, well, how loyal are you to this commission? Like, you know, you need to find what we tell you to find, was fundamentally, and you know, that was terrible. But one of the things, like when I was discussing with Edie, and I always bring the conversation back to her because I admire her a lot, to be honest. And she's a great fan, not in the way that you'd expect, of the French philosophers Derrida and Foucault. And I know you loathe them, and I used to too. But here's something. After she explained things to me, here's something I'd never thought I'd ever say. The French philosophers were right. Clearly, much of feminism and other issues of race and sexuality is not actually about helping women. It's not actually about helping people helping people who have or don't have melanin in their skin, or other poor, marginalised people. What we're seeing is the defence and validation of power structures that have been created around resentment and dependence to exploit those dependent people. And Edie basically said, look, Foucault and Derrida were not saying that this is a good thing and that's how it should happen. They were just recognising a power dynamic and making a comparison to the lofty statements that the West claims, its aspirational statements and the actual practice. They're saying, well, we don't believe the aspirational statements, we believe the practice, and the practice says the aspirational statements were a lie. And then they link that with what I've just said. So clearly it's not about these, it's not about the aspirational statements. Just don't even believe that. This is just about defending a system. But applying that rationale to feminism and all these other isms that are going there. I think they were right. I think this is just about the defense of the power structures that have been created around severely dependent people. I'd like your take on that.
I agree. And I hope she applies the insights that she has gained from Derrida and Foucault to feminism, and recognizes exactly that, because that is exactly my objection to it. What we find with all of sort of woke ideology, which comes out of feminism, which comes out of Marxism ultimately, is that it is interested in dividing people against one another. And we see that the stunning success of that division today. And it means that we don't look with the kind of scrutiny that we should be looking with at our leadership and at the power structure that does create dependence and helplessness, that benefits a few elite people and leaves the rest of us, men and women, blacks and whites, in positions of dependency or unmet need or helplessness. And that's what's so frustrating about feminism and all of the related kind of leftist orientations, that it does keep the elite people in their positions of power, virtue signaling all the way to the bank, and telling us what wonderful people they are because they care so much about women and about the underprivileged and non-whites, etc. Well, meanwhile, nothing changes for ordinary working people who find that their needs are not being listened to at all. And we end up then demonizing mostly working class white men and other men as well, men of color, who are demonized, and we're given permission to hate them because of their alleged privilege. And it's a terribly destructive strategy that prevents us from really seeing clearly what issues we can and should be tackling in our society. So that's why I speak against feminism, because I see that, yes, it doesn't benefit ordinary women. And in fact, it's not even interested in protecting ordinary women. I mean, I've looked at cases there was a case in Ottawa not too long ago where two women who had worked as pimps, who had been forcing underage girls as young as 14 and 15 years old into sex slavery. Those women were caught and were sentenced. They were given suspended sentences because the judge determined that they themselves were victims. They had abusive pasts, and that they were deserving of empathy and compassion. And I realized that is the real problem with the feminist idea of the woman as victim, is that it tends instead to exempt abusive women from power, from having to take responsibility for their actions. It exempts them from responsibility rather than actually protecting the vulnerable. Yeah. Those girls of 14 and 15 who are being exploited, the judge didn't have as much compassion for them as he had for their exploiters. And we see that quite often with abusive mothers, for example. We see it often in cases where women kill their husbands or their children. Always the narrative then is brought in saying this woman was abused and therefore she's not really responsible for what she did. But that just means that the victims continue not to be honored in the cases of victims who are killed, or continue not to be protected in cases where they are being abused. What we're really doing is just exempting those perpetrators from responsibility because they happen to be female. Most
and they're dehumanizing them as well, Prof.
It is dehumanizing. Of course it is. Yeah, it's infantilizing.
You're saying, well, you can't be responsible. I mean, that's every sexist stereotype, going back to.
And it's very damaging, I think, morally. If you grow up in a society that tells you you're not really responsible for any bad things you might do, and that everything you do should be applauded and celebrated. I think that's a really very dangerous thing to do to people. It creates feelings of narcissism, of grandiosity. It creates a victim mentality whereby one blames others rather than accepts responsibility when things go wrong in one's life. So I would say I would agree with your feminist friend that feminism is a power ideology in that sense. I don't think it actually helps anyone. I'm particularly concerned about the men that it doesn't help, that it doesn't even care about. But I think you could certainly make the case that it doesn't really care about ordinary women and their needs and their experiences very much at all either. So maybe we do agree on some things, but I think anybody who accepts that an ideology that divides the world up into oppressor and oppressed classes and gives a great deal of empathy to one class because it is allegedly oppressed and doesn't give empathy to the other people because they're allegedly oppressors and privileged, I think that is an evil ideology and really shouldn't have any place in a civilized society at all.
Yeah, I'm suspicious of anything that bases itself on resentment and bitterness. Can you tell me about some of the sanctions you've faced? Because you've actually gotten some trouble for speaking up on this. Can you tell me what's happened to you?
Well, anybody who speaks against the dominant narratives always gets accused of being hateful and being dangerous and of causing unsafe environment. I used to go and speak at university campuses, and all sorts of feminists would claim that I was making the campus unsafe for women because I was a rape apologist and I was creating a climate in which women were going to be attacked, and all sorts of crazy things that were taken quite seriously by some people. And I had that experience. It's a lot easier, I will say, to be a woman who speaks against feminism than to be a man who speaks against feminism. A man who speaks against feminism is a misogynist and the most despicable of human beings. A woman who speaks against feminism is somewhat despicable, but not quite as bad, and maybe has internalized misogyny or something like that. So I'm given a bit of a pass because I'm a woman. So I have to say that overall, I've had great fun, and I've met all sorts of wonderful people being an advocate for men and against feminist bigotry. I've had some backlash and complaints from students and various small hassles, but overall, I wouldn't say it's been terrible for me. I'd say it's been generally a privilege, and I've met lots of wonderful people doing it.
Were you banned from YouTube or anything like that?
Oh, well, I did have I had a YouTube. Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. Our YouTube channel, I made many videos called the Fiamengo File with my friend Steve Brule, who produced them. And we had a channel on YouTube called Studio Brule, and it was permanently banned. And we're not sure why. They never tell you why exactly. But we're starting up again. So anybody who would like to look at my work I have a new channel with my friend Steve, and it's called Studio B. And I'm doing a series on the history of feminism, especially in the 19th century, and looking at all of the ways in which the real history of feminism disproves the assertion that feminism was ever about equality, and also shows the significant power that women always had to affect their societies and to have their demands listened to.
Absolutely, and I'll definitely be putting the hyperlinks into the comments field. I'm a fanboy. Okay, final questions.
Thank you. Well,
you're an English professor, and that's your thing. I too am a voracious reader, and you've described yourself in some of your interviews as enchanted with language. So my wrap-up questions are this: what do you love about English? Who's your favorite author? And can you give a suggested reading list for my feminist inclined daughter who's looking for positive female role models in literature?
In literature, wow. I would like to recommend a couple of books for your feminist inclined daughter that are not literary works per se. They are nonfiction works, but I would say that a good place for her to start, if she's feminist inclined inclined, but kind of wants to get another side of the story, she should look at Christina Hoff Sommers' book, Who Stole Feminism? Christina Hoff Sommers still defines herself as a feminist, but she has a lot of criticisms of the inaccuracies and outright misrepresentations of feminist claims. And those are beautifully laid out in that book, Who Stole Feminism by Christina Hoff Sommers. And I would also recommend a book by Daphne Patai, also still calls herself, I believe, a feminist. They call themselves equity feminists or oppositional feminists. Daphne Patai, her book is called Heterophobia, Sexual Harassment, and the Future of Feminism. And it's a fascinating look at what she calls the sexual harassment industry and all of the harms that it has done, both in legal terms and in terms of policies in the workplace that automatically believe that when a woman makes a complaint, the man must be guilty, and all the harms that has done, particularly to men, but to women as well. Those are two excellent nonfiction books. In terms of fiction, I'd have to go back to the great classic, and that is Jane Austen. She's probably my all-time favorite novelist. She was concerned with the question of virtue. That is the question that has been most absent from contemporary discussions. She was interested in what virtue looks like in both men and women, and the difficulty of being virtuous in a world where there are all sorts of rewards for not being so, where the temptation to selfishness and greed and lack of empathy for others is, and dishonesty is often overwhelming. But she insisted that the good life, the only way to be truly happy was to live a good life, that happiness was not a feeling, but a life based on ethical conduct and reason. And I think that she was writing at a time just before what's called the Romantic Revolution, when feeling became the dominant issue. You're supposed to do what you felt like doing. She didn't believe that that was a good way of living one's life. In fact, feeling was to be resisted in many cases because it could lead one astray. And I think she is a very powerfully still relevant commentator on our own era, when we often also believe that you should do what you feel rather than live according to virtuous precepts. So I would say that her heroines provide very powerful role models for young women today, if one is of a traditionalist bent, which I guess I am. So
fantastic. Look, that was absolutely great. I'll definitely be getting that for my girls, because they're starving for it. Like, I see these young women out there, and they're watching Wonder Woman, they're watching Moana, they're watching Frozen, they're watching all these other things, and I kind of like, I enjoy the spectacle and I enjoy the music. But I think to myself, especially the Wonder Woman ones, I was going, that's actually, and Harley Quinn, that's the other role model who my daughter really looks up to. I go, she's not actually a woman. She's a man. Like, she's actually a man. Like,
yeah.
They're
That's a whole other topic. But I agree.
They're celebrating masculine values and virtues.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the womanliness here? Where's the femininity?
Yeah, exactly.
So what I really want to do is kind of like, and she's interested in it. She's hungered. She wants to know these. She wants to get a role model that she can empathize with and copy, and she wants all of those things, something that's kind of relevant to her, like a twin-dyed haired psychopathic criminal. It's perhaps not the best role model. But they're our modern day saints.